This morning, we are walking into a forest that has belonged to a community of monks for nearly 170 years. Somewhere ahead of us, hidden on a wooded point across a lake, stands a little chapel that has burned to its foundation, been rebuilt by hand, and been watched over by Benedictines through it all. Behind us rises a concrete church holding the largest wall of stained glass in the world. This is the chapel trail at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. It is one of the most storied walks in the state, and almost nobody outside Minnesota has heard of it. Let us fix that. We are in central Minnesota, in Stearns County, about 70 miles northwest of Minneapolis and just west of the city of St. Cloud. The place is called Collegeville, and the name is not an accident. This entire landscape of woods, lakes, and prairie belongs to St. John's Abbey and University, a Benedictine monastery and school whose grounds cover roughly 2,500 acres. At the heart of it lies Lake Sagatagan, and our trail traces its wooded shore. The goal of this hike is a small chapel called Stella, sitting on a point across the water from the Abbey. It is early September, and the maple woods are still deep green. The walk begins where the manicured campus gives way to forest, and the change is immediate. Pavement turns to packed earth, and the sounds of the university fade behind the trees. Students, monks, and visitors have been making this exact walk for generations in every season, and the path is worn smooth by all those footsteps. It is a groomed trail, part of a network the community maintains for hiking and Nordic skiing. But this one, the Chapel Walk, is the famous one. Everyone at St. John's knows it simply by that name. Every hill on this trail was left here by ice. The land under St. John's is a rolling glacial moraine, a jumble of ridges and hollows dumped by the great ice sheets as they stalled and melted over central Minnesota. When the ice finally withdrew, stranded blocks of it melted into the hollows and became lakes, and Lake Sagatagan is one of them. That is why this country rolls the way it does, why the trail is always climbing or dropping, and why water seems to appear around every bend. The monks did not level it or drain it. They simply built their home on the high ground and let the moraine stay wild. Through the trunks on our left, Lake Sagatagan opens up, calm and silver in the morning light. When the monks first settled on its northern shore, they named their new monastery St. Louis on the lake, and for a while that was the official name of this whole community. The lake has been the center of life here ever since. Monks have skated on it, fished it, hauled building materials across its ice, and walked this shoreline in prayer for more than a century and a half. The trail we are on hugs the water most of the way to the chapel. Keep the lake on your left and you cannot get lost. The story begins in 1856, when 5 Benedictine monks arrived in St. Cloud from St. Vincent Archabbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. They had come at the request of the Bishop of St. Paul to serve the German Catholic immigrants who were flooding into central Minnesota. Most of the monks spoke German as their first language, just like the settlers they came to serve. They started on a tract of land beside the Mississippi River south of St. Cloud. Then the land deal went bad, because the well-meaning donors of that property turned out not to hold legal title to it. So the monks looked west, into the woods. They found a low, sheltered valley a few miles west of the town of St. Joseph and called it the Sconthal, the Beautiful Valley. In 1864, they built a sturdy priory house there, and by then the community had grown to 16 priests and brothers. But the lowland was damp and cramped, no place for the college they intended to build. So in 1866, they moved about a mile through the woods to higher ground on the north shore of the lake. That same year, the priory was raised to the rank of abbey, and the monks elected Rupert Seidenbush as their first abbot. The community has been on this spot ever since. The forest closes in now, and it is a beautiful thing to walk through. These are northern hardwoods, maple and oak and basswood, the kind of woods that turn to fire in October. The Abbey has protected this forest from the beginning, cutting it carefully for fuel and lumber but never clearing it. That restraint, held for a century and a half, is why the trail feels this old and this deep. Watch the light shift as the canopy thickens overhead. There are stretches of this walk where you could believe you were miles from any building. Education was part of the plan from the very first winter. In 1857, the monks secured a territorial charter to run a seminary for educational, scientific, and religious purposes. That November, they enrolled 5 local boys as the first students of St. John's College. From that tiny classroom grew St. John's University, which today stands as the oldest continuously operating institution of higher learning in Minnesota. Think about that for a moment. The school is older than the state itself, chartered while Minnesota was still a territory. The trail rises and falls with the moraine, and every rise gives you a new angle on the water. This is the same high ground that drew the monks out of their beautiful valley. Higher land meant dry foundations, room for a college, and a lake at the doorstep. Under Abbot Rupert, the community structured the school into a degree-granting college and seminary and began putting up its first brick buildings. In 9 years, he laid the foundations of everything that followed. Then he was named a bishop and headed north, and the building really began. Here is a detail I love, because St. John's was not built from imported stone or lumber shipped in by rail. It was built of bricks the monks made themselves, on site, from local clay, fired in their own brickyards. Over a span of 20 years, their great quadrangle building took shape section by section, brick by handmade brick. Those bricks have a distinctive soft texture and an orange ochre tone that you can still see today. A century after they were laid, workers actually stripped the fine plaster off many interior walls just to show the homemade brick underneath. The building material became the heirloom. The second abbot, Alexius Edelbrock, pulled those first brick buildings together into one enormous 5-story quadrangle, completed in 1886. It held classrooms, dining rooms, dormitories, and private rooms for monks and seminarians, all under one roof. Some of his own monks grumbled that it was far too big and a waste of money. History sided with the abbot. Thanks to its solid construction, the quadrangle has been adapted to use after use for well over a century, and its space has seldom sat empty. At first, the plumbing was just cold lake water piped to faucets in the corridors, and heat came from wood stoves until steam arrived in 1888. Down here by the water, the trail flattens out and the lake does the talking. On a still September morning like this one, Sagatagan turns into a mirror, doubling the tree line in the sky. It is easy to see why the monks chose to keep this shoreline as a place for walking rather than building. The whole far shore is unbroken forest. Herons work the shallows, and turtles line up on the deadfalls when the sun is out. The chapel is still ahead of us, tucked out of sight on its point. For most of its history, this abbey aimed to feed and power itself. The early monks dammed a small stream north of the farmyard to gain water power for their grain and lumber mills, and the backed-up water became Lake Wathab, nicknamed Stump Lake for the tree stumps left sticking out of it. Behind the quadrangle stood shops, mills, and barns, a dairy herd and beef cattle, hog pens, gardens, a potato cellar, and sauerkraut curing in 30-gallon jars. The brick butcher shop from 1878 and its adjoining smokehouse still stand. There was even a wax house, where wax from the Abbey beehives was made into candles. The farming era lasted until 1958, when the monks sold their herd of 100 registered Holstein dairy cattle. In the Abbey orchard, a monk named Father John Katzner spent decades experimenting with new northern apple varieties bred to survive brutal Minnesota winters. He was acclaimed for that work, and also for developing the Alpha grape, a cold country grape from a man who lived his whole life among frozen lakes. It says something about this community. They did not just endure this landscape, they studied it, worked with it, and coaxed sweetness out of it. Orchards, bees, maple trees, grain fields. The whole place was one long, patient experiment in living well on Minnesota land. Now the trail bends around the lake and we are on the final approach to the reason for this walk. Somewhere ahead, through the trees, is Stella Maris, the little chapel the monks built across the water from their abbey. Generations of students have walked this path to it, in daylight and by lantern, in summer heat and across winter ice. It is the kind of destination that turns a stroll into a small pilgrimage. The woods feel older here, and the path narrows. Let me tell you the chapel's story, because it has earned it. In 1872, the monks of St. John's built a small, picturesque chapel across the waters of Lake Sagatagan to honor Mary. Getting materials to a roadless point of forest was the hard part. They hauled everything over the frozen lake by sled in winter and by horse-drawn wagon in summer. The finished chapel was a little Gothic structure of red brick, and they named it Stella Maris, which means Star of the Sea, an ancient title for the Virgin Mary. Picture that first version standing alone on the wooded point, its reflection in the water visible from the Abbey windows. For 3 decades, it was the beloved landmark of the lake. Then in 1903, lightning found it. The strike set the little chapel ablaze, and it burned all the way down to its foundation. There were no pumps or fire crews that could reach a wooded point across a lake, so the community could only watch the glow from the far shore. 31 years of devotion went up in a single storm, and here is the part that surprises people. The chapel stayed a ruin for 12 years, its bare foundation sitting quietly among the trees, while the community gathered the will and the means to build again. Walk this stretch and imagine those years from 1903 to 1915, when students strolled out here to a blackened foundation on an empty point. Places like this hold their stories in layers, and absence is one of the layers. The lake kept its name, the path stayed worn, and people kept coming even with nothing at the end of the walk but a view and a memory. That tells you the walk itself was always part of the point. The destination was coming back. In 1915, the chapel rose again, and this time one of the community's own designed it. A St. John's monk named Gilbert Winkelmann drew up a larger chapel in the Romanesque style, with rounded arches instead of Gothic points, a wooden altar, a steeple, and a statue of the Blessed Mother. That 1915 structure is the very building waiting for us at the end of this trail. It has stood on the point for more than a century now, 3 times as long as the original lasted. Lightning has left it alone. A small building in deep woods survives only because people keep choosing to save it, and Stella has needed saving more than once. In 1943, its stolen cornerstone was replaced. The walls were reinforced, and stained glass windows were installed. By 1989, age had caught up with it again, and it got a new roof, wall repairs, and a new altar. Then in 2007, as St. John's celebrated 150 years, an alumnus of the prep school, Don Hall, class of 1955, financed a full remodel. That is the chapel we see today, small, bright, and cared for. Every generation has left fingerprints on it. Now look back across the water toward campus, because the Abbey answered this humble brick chapel with one of the boldest churches ever built in America. In 1953, the monks approved a sweeping campus plan by Marcel Breuer, the famous Bauhaus modernist, and then commissioned him to design a new Abbey church in raw concrete. It went up between 1958 and 1961. In front of it, Breuer raised his signature, a freestanding concrete bell banner that climbs 112 vertical feet and holds 5 bells that still call the community to prayer. A medieval community of monks hired one of the most daring architects alive. It remains one of his most celebrated works. From out here on the trail, the contrast is the whole story of St. John's in a single view. On this side of the lake, a hand-built brick chapel from 1915. Across the water, a concrete banner from the space age, designed to hold bells the way a medieval tower did. The church was shaped so that a congregation of more than 2,000 could gather closely around the altar, with the monastic choir curved in a semicircle. Breuer and the monks were anticipating reforms in worship years before the church at large caught up. Tradition and boldness, side by side across one small Minnesota lake. The north face of that Abbey church is something you have to see with your own eyes at least once. It is the largest wall of stained glass in the world, a vast concrete honeycomb filled with 430 colored hexagons of abstract design. On a bright day, the whole interior glows like the inside of a kaleidoscope. There is no traditional imagery in it, no saints or scenes, just pure fields of color arranged like light itself made into architecture. Below the church in the undercroft, a small chapel holds the relics of Saint Peregrine, an early Christian martyr, ancient bones beneath modern glass. St. John's collects wonders at every scale, and the walk gives you time to tally them. The Abbey Church holds a pipe organ with more than 6,000 pipes, rebuilt and expanded in recent years into one of the great instruments of the region. The monks run a woodworking shop and even build organs. Liturgical Press, one of the major Catholic publishing houses, operates right here on the grounds. And still, ask anyone who has lived here what they treasure most, and many will name this plain dirt path around the lake. Grand things fade next to a good walk. Here is the project that made headlines around the world. In 1998, the Benedictines of St. John's commissioned master calligrapher Donald Jackson to create a complete handwritten and illuminated Bible. It was the first such Bible commissioned by a Benedictine monastery since the invention of the printing press, which is to say, the first in roughly 500 years. Jackson had dreamed of the project his entire working life. A team of 23 artists and calligraphers took it on, working in a scriptorium in Wales and in Minnesota. Monks of the machine age reached back to the oldest craft their order ever practiced. The St. John's Bible was made the old way, without shortcuts. The text was written on calf skin vellum with quills cut from turkey, goose, and swan feathers, using hand-ground pigments, gold leaf and platinum leaf. Open, each page spread measures 2 feet tall by 3 feet wide. The finished work runs 7 volumes, 1,100 pages and 160 illuminations, and it took 13 years, finishing in December of 2011. The project cost more than $8 million. Somewhere between the quill and the gold, 5 centuries simply folded shut. One more quirky thread in this forest. The original studio of Minnesota Public Radio sits on the Abbey grounds, because the network that now reaches millions of listeners began here as a small monastic college station. It fits a pattern you start to notice at St. John's. Brickyards, publishing presses, apple breeding, radio, a handwritten Bible. Again and again, this community out in the woods decided that isolation was no excuse for thinking small. The quiet of a place like this is not emptiness but concentration. In 1997, the community formally designated its lands as St. John's Arboretum, more than 2,500 acres of oak savanna, forest, prairie, wetlands, and lakes. Oak savanna is the rarest of those habitats, a parkland of scattered broad-crowned oaks over grass that once covered huge stretches of the Midwest and has nearly vanished. Here it is protected and restored alongside tallgrass prairie and cattail marsh. The Arboretum is laced with trails like the one under our feet, open to anyone who wants to walk them. It is one of the largest outdoor classrooms in Minnesota, and it doubles as the monks' backyard. Come back in late March, and these maple woods go to work. St. John's taps its sugar maples and boils the sap over a wood-fired evaporator, a tradition kept alive by monks, students, and volunteers together. In a single season, the crew can burn through a dozen cords of firewood hauled load by load to the sugar shack, and the community celebrates with a maple syrup festival. It takes roughly 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, so every jar represents a small mountain of labor. The same woods that shade our hike in September sweeten the pancakes of central Minnesota in spring. Land this well-loved gives back in every season. As the walk comes full circle, consider what this community has weathered. At its peak in the early 1950s, St. John's Abbey numbered around 450 monks. Today about 110 remain, yet it still stands among the largest Benedictine abbeys in the Western Hemisphere. The Quadrangle still serves, the banner still rings its 5 bells, and Stella still watches the lake from its point. Buildings burn, herds are sold, eras end, and the walk to the chapel goes on. Few trails anywhere let you stroll through nearly 170 years in a single morning. The chapel trail at St. John's is proof that a great hike does not need mountains. It needs woods with a memory, water with a story, and a destination that people have loved enough to rebuild. If you find yourself near St. Cloud, Minnesota, give this lake a morning and walk to the Star of the Sea. Go quietly, the way generations have gone before you. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.